On the 6th of May, 1937, at 25 minutes past 7 in the evening, the largest flying machine ever built by human beings was hanging 80 meters above a field in New Jersey with its mooring lines already on the ground. 245 meters long. 4 diesel engines. A dining room with a grand piano in it. 36 passengers and 61 crew aboard. 32 seconds later it did not exist. Here is the number that should stop you, because it stops everyone who looks at this properly. 97 people were aboard that airship when it caught fire. 35 of them died. Which means 62 people walked, ran, jumped or were dragged out of the most photographed fire in history, and survived it. And here is the second thing, which almost nobody knows. Everyone will tell you what caused it. Hydrogen, they will say. Case closed, 70 years ago. Except that it is not closed, and it never was. 2 separate government investigations reported in 1937, one American, one German, and both of them stated, in writing, that the source of ignition could not be determined. Hydrogen explains why it burned. It does not explain what lit it. That question has been open for 88 years, there are 3 serious answers, and one of them accuses a member of the crew by name. To understand the 32 seconds you have to understand the machine, and the machine is difficult to picture because nothing like it has existed since. The Hindenburg was 245 meters long, 3.5 times the length of a Boeing 747, and only 24 meters shorter than the Titanic. It cruised at about 125 kilometers an hour, which is slow, and it crossed the Atlantic in 2.5 days, which in 1936 was less than half the time of the fastest ocean liner. Inside there was a dining room, a lounge with a lightweight aluminum grand piano, a writing room, a promenade with windows that opened, and a smoking room, pressurized, behind an airlock, with a single electric lighter chained to the wall, because the ship was filled with 200,000 cubic meters of hydrogen. Sit with that for a second. They built a smoking room, inside a hydrogen balloon, and it worked. Nobody was ever hurt by it. Which tells you something about how carefully these people understood the thing they were flying. It helps to know how one of these was actually put together, because the structure explains both why she burned the way she did and why so many people got out. The skeleton was a series of enormous rings of duralumin girders, 15 of them, joined by longitudinal beams running the length of the hull. Inside that cage sat 16 separate gas cells, each one an independent bag. That is the crucial point, the gas was not in one space. It was in 16, and losing one was not supposed to matter. The cells themselves were the strangest piece of engineering on the ship. Earlier Zeppelins used goldbeater's skin, the outer membrane of cattle intestines, beaten thin and layered. It took the intestines of roughly 200,000 animals to line one airship. The Hindenburg used a newer gelatin latex fabric, but the principle was the same, something thin enough to be light and tight enough to hold the smallest molecule there is. Over the cage went the outer cover, cotton fabric, doped with a lacquer to make it taut and weatherproof, and it is that lacquer that becomes theory number 2 later on. Underneath ran a keel corridor, a walkway along the bottom of the ship where crew moved from end to end. And hanging below, in 4 separate gondolas, were the engines. Those engines were diesel, not petrol, chosen deliberately, because diesel fuel does not give off explosive vapor at ordinary temperatures. Every large decision on that ship was made by someone thinking about fire. A mechanic sat in each engine gondola for the entire crossing, in the noise, watching gauges, reachable only by a ladder from the hull. For men, hanging under an airship over the Atlantic, for 2.5 days at a time. And the whole thing was flown from a control car under the bow, with a wheel for the rudder and a separate wheel for the elevators, worked by 2 different men standing at right angles to each other. Steering it left and right and steering it up and down were two separate jobs. Because the safety record was not merely good. It was perfect. Her predecessor, the Graf Zeppelin, had flown for 9 years, covered more than 1.5 million kilometers, circled the globe, crossed the Atlantic 144 times, and carried 34,000 passengers without injuring a single one of them. The Hindenburg herself had completed her entire first season, 17 round trips across the Atlantic in 1936, 34 ocean crossings, without a single serious incident. When she left Frankfurt on the 3rd of May 1937 she was, by the numbers, the safest way to cross an ocean that had ever been invented. It is worth understanding what these ships actually were to the people who used them, because the word airship makes them sound primitive and they were the opposite. A ticket cost $400 one way in 1936, roughly $9,000 today. You got a private cabin, a steward, meals cooked in an electric galley, and windows that opened. And the flying was extraordinarily smooth. There was no cabin pressure, because you were never high enough to need it. She cruised at 200 or 300 meters, low enough that passengers could see people in fields waving at them, and slow enough that the windows could be open the whole way across an ocean. Passengers described it as being on a very quiet ship rather than in an aircraft. Several wrote that they only knew they were moving when they looked down. That is what was lost on the 6th of May, and it has never been rebuilt. There is one more thing about the Hindenburg specifically that shaped everything, and it is the part people are least comfortable with. She was an instrument of the German state. The propaganda ministry had put money into her and it wanted the return. In March 1936, before she had even entered passenger service, she was sent on a 4-day flight over Germany dropping leaflets and playing marching music from loudspeakers for a referendum. Hugo Eckener objected to the use of his ships this way, said so, and was for a period declared a non-person by the German press. That matters for 2 reasons. It is why she flew over the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. And it is why, when she arrived over New York with swastikas on her tail fins, she was the most conspicuous political object in the sky, which is the entire basis of the third theory we will come to. Which is exactly why what happened next destroyed an entire industry in half a minute. There is one design decision underneath all of this, and it was not made by the people who built the ship. The Hindenburg was designed for helium. Helium does not burn. The engineers wanted it, the plan specified it, and the gas cells were built to hold it. There was only one problem. In 1937 essentially all the helium on Earth came from natural gas fields in the United States, and the United States had banned its export. The Helium Control Act of 1927 made it a federal matter, and by 1937 the man who had to sign the export license was Interior Secretary Harold Ickes, who looked at a German airship flying under a swastika and declined. There were reasons. It was 1937, and Germany was rearming. So the ship was filled with hydrogen instead, lighter, cheaper, more lift, and flammable. The Zeppelin company knew precisely what that meant and built the entire operation around it. Crew wore hemp-soled shoes so they could not strike sparks. Their clothing was checked for static. Tools were made of non-sparking alloys. Every visitor was searched for matches. They were not careless. That is the thing to hold on to when you hear people say it was an accident waiting to happen. These were the most experienced hydrogen airship operators who have ever lived, and they had gone 9 years without hurting anybody. The last flight left Frankfurt on the evening of the 3rd of May, 1937, with 36 passengers, about half the capacity, because the season had only just opened, and 61 crew. That crew number is unusually high, and there is a reason for it. Several were trainees being brought up for the second ship, the Graf Zeppelin II, which was almost finished. It is worth knowing who was actually on board, because the passenger list of that flight is not what people imagine. There were businessmen crossing for work, a German advertising executive, a Swedish industrialist, an American colonel returning from the coronation preparations in London. There was a family of 4, the Dunners, traveling home to Mexico City after a holiday in Germany, with 3 children aged 8, 6 and 14. Matilda Dunner pushed 2 of her children out of a promenade window as the ship came down. Both survived. She threw the third, her 8-year-old daughter Irene, but Irene was caught in the wreckage. She was the youngest person to die at Lakehurst. Her father died as well. Her mother and 2 brothers lived. There was also, on this crossing, a photojournalist, a physician, and a man traveling with a trunk of samples. And a significant number of the crew were, in the strict sense, supernumerary. They did not need to be on that flight at all. That is because the company was training up men for the next ship. The Graf Zeppelin II was nearly complete in the shed at Frankfurt, and she needed a crew. So the Hindenburg was carrying trainees on a routine crossing to get them their hours. It is why the crew number was 61 rather than the 40 or so that flying her actually required. Which means a large share of the 22 crew who died that evening were aboard to learn a trade that ceased to exist 32 seconds after the fire started. The crossing itself was slow. Headwinds over the North Atlantic put her hours behind schedule. By the morning of the 6th of May she was over Boston, and by the afternoon she was over New York, and this is where the most famous photographs of her come from. She flew low over Manhattan. People came out onto rooftops. She passed the Empire State Building, which had been designed, only 6 years earlier, with a mooring mast on top for exactly this kind of ship, a plan that never worked because of the winds. Passengers waved from open windows 200 meters above the city. Her 1936 season is worth 1 minute, because it shows what this service actually was before it became a newsreel. She opened the North Atlantic route in May 1936 and ran it all summer, Frankfurt to Lakehurst, and later Frankfurt to Rio de Janeiro. 10 round trips to America, 7 to Brazil. In August she flew over the Olympic Stadium in Berlin during the opening ceremony, trailing the Olympic flag on a long line beneath her. In October she made a special flight out of Lakehurst for around 70 American businessmen and financiers, a 10-hour circuit over New England, lunch served in the dining room, designed to sell the service to people who could afford it. It was called the Millionaire's Flight, and it worked. The 1937 season was heavily booked. Which is why the flight that burned was only half full. It was the first crossing of the new season, opening early in the year. The bookings were for later. Then she turned south for Lakehurst, and ran into weather. A line of thunderstorms was sitting over the Naval Air Station. The landing was postponed. She cruised up and down the New Jersey coast for hours, burning time and waiting for it to clear. The station finally radioed that conditions were improving and recommended landing at the earliest possible moment. Remember the thunderstorms. Every serious theory about what happened depends on them. At about 7 in the evening she approached the field. Captain Max Pruss had the ship. And he chose to do something that has been argued about ever since, a high landing, sometimes called a flying moor, where the airship hovers well above the ground and is winched down by the mooring lines rather than being walked down by a ground crew. It saves time, and he was hours late. It also requires the ship to be trimmed very precisely, because there is no ground crew holding her level. She came in too heavy at the stern. Pruss ordered water ballast dropped aft, about half a ton, then more. It was not enough. Then he sent 6 crewmen forward, running along the internal keel walkway to the bow, to shift their weight and bring the nose down. Before that, at about 7:11, he had also made 2 sharp turns in quick succession to line up with the mast. Those turns are the first suspect in this entire case, and we will come back to them. At about 7:21 the mooring lines were dropped from the bow. They hit the ground, which was wet from the storms. And that detail, wet ropes touching wet ground, matters more than anything else in the next 4 minutes. Because the ship had just spent hours flying through an electrically charged sky. And the moment those wet lines touched the earth, the metal frame inside her was grounded, while the fabric skin stretched over that frame was not. At about 25 minutes past 7, several people on the ground saw something at the top of the hull, forward of the upper fin, on the port side. Descriptions vary. Some said a flutter of the fabric, as though gas was moving inside. Some said a small blue flame. One crewman inside reported a muffled thump. Then the whole stern section lit up. What happens over the next half-minute is preserved better than almost any event of the 20th century. There were newsreel cameras from 4 companies on the field. There were press photographers. There were radio reporters. All of them were there for what was supposed to be a routine arrival, which is why we have this at all. The stern dropped first, because that is where the gas was going. The bow rose, briefly, pointing upward with the fire chasing forward inside her. Then she came down flat, folding onto the field, and the fire took the rest. From the first visible flame to the ship on the ground, about 32 seconds. Some analyses say 34. Either way, a structure the length of 3 football pitches came apart in less time than it takes to read this paragraph aloud. It is worth walking those seconds properly, because the film is so familiar that people stop seeing what is in it. First, the glow. Before there is any visible flame from outside, the fabric near the top of the stern lights up from within, the fire is inside the hull, burning in the space between the gas cells and the cover, and you are watching it through the skin. Second, the shape of the fireball. It does not billow outward. It goes vertically, in a column, because that is what hydrogen does. The most destructive fire in the history of commercial aviation is going almost entirely in the one direction that keeps the people underneath it alive. Third, the fall is slow. She is enormous and she is still buoyant at the bow, so she does not drop, she settles, tail first, over several seconds, hinging around the middle. That slowness is the reason a man could hang from a window ledge and wait for the ground to come to him. Fourth, and this is the detail that unsettles people once they notice it, near the end of the footage, as the bow comes down, you can see figures moving. Not falling. Running. And fifth, the diesel fuel. The hydrogen was gone in seconds. What burned for hours afterwards, and what made the photographs from the following morning look like a bombed factory, was several tons of diesel oil in the tanks along the keel. And now the part that everybody gets wrong. 62 of the 97 people aboard survived. That is not a rounding error and it is not luck. It is physics, and it is the single most misunderstood thing about this disaster. Hydrogen is the lightest element there is. When it burns it goes straight up, extremely fast, and it takes the heat with it. Look at any photograph of the disaster and you will see it, an enormous fireball sitting above the ship, and underneath it, a hull that is still recognizably a hull. So for a few seconds, the space directly underneath the burning gas was survivable. As the ship settled onto the field, passengers in the promenade simply opened the windows they had been waving from and jumped, some from 10 meters, some from 3, as the hull came down. The ground crew, and this deserves saying plainly, ran towards it. Men on that field ran underneath a burning airship to pull people out from under it, while the diesel fuel was still going up. Several of the survivors owe their lives entirely to that. The people who died mostly died for 2 reasons. The crew were inside the structure, deep in the hull, with a long way to get out, 22 of the 35 dead were crew. And several passengers jumped too early, from too high, before the ship had settled. One man on the ground was killed, a civilian line handler named Alan Hageman. He is usually left out of the count entirely, which seems to me a small injustice worth correcting. And some of the individual escapes from that ship are so unlikely that if you put them in a film nobody would believe you. Werner Franz was 14 years old. He was the cabin boy, the youngest person aboard, and when the fire started he was clearing dishes in the officers' mess, deep inside the hull, which is close to the worst place on that ship to be. The ship tilted. He was knocked down. And then a water ballast tank directly above him burst open and emptied itself over his head, several hundred liters of cold water, soaking him through at the exact moment the fire reached that section. He got to a hatch, kicked it open, and ran out from under a burning airship. He was not injured. He lived until 2014. Joseph Spa was a vaudeville acrobat, traveling to New York, and he had spent the crossing filming with a home movie camera, which is why some of the footage from inside that ship exists at all. When the fire started he was at a promenade window with the camera running. He smashed the window, climbed out, and hung from the window ledge by his hands, an acrobat, doing the one thing an acrobat can do, waiting for the hull to come down far enough to drop. He let go from about 6 meters, hit the ground, and ran. He sprained an ankle. That is the extent of his injuries. Captain Max Pruss, who was flying the ship, stayed at his post until she was on the ground, then went back into the wreck to look for passengers. He was pulled out with burns so severe that he was not expected to live. He did live, for another 23 years, and he spent much of them arguing that airships should fly again. And Ernst Lehmann, the company's senior captain, who was aboard that night as an observer and not in command, walked out of the fire on his own feet, badly burned, and was heard to say that he could not understand it. He died the next day. There was also a dog. A German shepherd named Ola, being brought to New York as a gift, was in the freight room in the stern, the part of the ship that burned first. She did not get out. It is a small detail in a large disaster, and it is the one that people who read the passenger manifests tend to remember. There is also the voice, and you have heard it even if you do not know you have. Herbert Morrison was a radio reporter from Chicago recording a description of a routine arrival onto a disc. His recording is where the line comes from, "Oh, the humanity," and the reason his voice sounds so strange is partly that the recording ran slightly slow and was played back fast for years. It was not broadcast live. It went out the next day. 2 investigations opened within days, an American board under the Commerce Department, and a German commission that included Hugo Eckener, the man who had built the Zeppelin company into what it was, and who had opposed the Nazi decoration of his own ships. Both boards agreed on the general mechanism: hydrogen had leaked somewhere in the stern, mixed with air, and been ignited by an electrical discharge. And both boards then said, explicitly, that they could not establish where the leak came from or what produced the spark. That is not a technicality. A conclusion of this kind normally names an ignition source. These did not, and both boards were staffed by people who very much wanted one, the German side because a mechanical fault would ruin the company, the American side because it had certified the operation. The hearings themselves are worth a moment, because of who was sitting in the room. The American board sat at Lakehurst within days, in a hangar next to the wreckage, and took testimony from surviving crew, ground handlers, and witnesses. Hugo Eckener flew over from Germany and was invited to participate. He walked the wreck himself. Eckener was in an impossible position and everyone knew it. He was the world authority on these ships. He was also, at that moment, a German citizen answering questions in America about a German state asset, and he had already been declared persona non grata at home for objecting to how his ships were used. Whatever he concluded would be read politically. His initial public statement pointed at a broken bracing wire and a static discharge, which is Theory 1, and which he arrived at within days. He held to it for the rest of his life. But the formal finding, the one both commissions signed, stopped short of naming the ignition source, and it stopped short deliberately. Commander Rosendahl, who ran Lakehurst, pushed hard in the other direction. He had watched it from the ground, he did not accept the static explanation, and he spent years afterwards collecting material for a sabotage case. He never produced physical evidence, and the board he sat with did not follow him. There is one more piece of the aftermath that says a great deal about 1937. The wreckage, hundreds of tons of duralumin girders, the most valuable aluminium alloy of the day, was collected up, sold as scrap, and shipped back to Germany, where it went into the aircraft industry. The metal of the Hindenburg went into German aeroplanes 2 years before the war. So we are left with 3 candidates. As always on this channel, they are questions, not verdicts. Theory 1, static discharge igniting a hydrogen leak. This is the mainstream answer, and it has the most physical support. Remember those 2 sharp turns at 7-Eleven. The proposal is that the stress of turning a 245-meter structure hard, twice, snapped a bracing wire inside the hull, and that the loose wire slashed one of the gas cells in the stern. Crewmen did report the ship being stern-heavy afterwards, which is what a leaking aft gas cell would produce. Then the mooring lines. Wet rope onto wet ground grounds the metal frame. The outer fabric, which was not adequately connected to that frame, holds its charge. You now have a voltage difference across a hull that has hydrogen leaking out of the top of it. Several witnesses described St. Elmo's fire, a bluish glow along the ship's back, in the minutes before. That is a visible sign of exactly this kind of charge. And the fire started where the leak would have been. The weakness of this theory is that every link in it is inferred. No broken wire was ever recovered and identified. No slashed gas cell survived to be examined. It is a reconstruction built from what must have happened, and reconstructions of that kind are exactly what the 2 boards refused to sign off on. Theory 2, and this one had a serious run in the 1990s, it was not the hydrogen that killed her. It was the paint. A former NASA hydrogen safety engineer named Addison Bain examined surviving fabric samples and pointed out what the outer cover was actually made of, cellulose acetate butyrate, doped with iron oxide and powdered aluminium. Those last 2, mixed together, are the basic components of thermite, and aluminium powder is a solid rocket fuel oxidizer. Bain argued the skin itself was the fuel, and that the hydrogen merely fed a fire that had already started in the fabric. It is a genuinely compelling idea and it got serious attention. And then people tested it. Physicist Alexander Dessler and others burned samples of the actual doped fabric. It burns, but slowly. Far too slowly to consume a 245-meter airship in 32 seconds. Later television experiments reproduced the same result, fabric alone smolders, fabric plus hydrogen goes up in seconds. So theory 2 is mostly dead as a primary cause. But it left something useful behind. The paint may not have started the fire, but it very probably helped it spread, and it explains why the flame front moved across the surface the way the film shows. Theory 3 is the one nobody at the time wanted to say out loud in public, and one very senior American officer never stopped believing it. Commander Charles Rosendahl was in command at Lakehurst and was the most experienced American airship officer alive. He watched it happen. He testified at the inquiry. And he wrote afterwards that he believed the ship had been destroyed deliberately. The context is not nothing. The Hindenburg was the most visible object in the world carrying Nazi markings. It was flying propaganda. Threatening letters had been received, one specific enough that the German embassy had passed it on, and passenger luggage was searched at Frankfurt because of it. In 1972 the writer Michael Mooney published a book naming a specific crew member, a rigger called Erich Spell, who had access to the stern, who had an anti-Nazi girlfriend, who was a keen amateur photographer with access to flashbulbs and batteries, and who died in a fire. The evidence for that accusation is entirely circumstantial and Spell cannot answer it. No physical trace of an incendiary device was ever found. Both 1937 boards examined Sabotage and dismissed it for lack of evidence, and no document supporting it has surfaced in the 88 years since, including from German archives opened after the war. But it stays on the list for one honest reason. It is the only theory that supplies an ignition source, and the ignition source is precisely the thing nobody has ever been able to name. The question was reopened seriously in 2013, and by people with equipment nobody had in 1937. A team led by the engineer Jem Stansfield built scale models of the airship, properly scaled, with the correct fabric, the correct doping, and hydrogen in the cells, and set fire to them under controlled conditions, filming at high speed. They tested the paint theory directly. A model with the doped skin and no hydrogen burned, but slowly, from the point of ignition outward, nothing like the film. A model with hydrogen behaved exactly like the newsreel, fire along the top of the hull, the stern dropping, the whole thing gone in seconds. They also tested the charge mechanism, and this is the useful part. They showed that an airship flying through a charged sky picks up a static charge across its skin, and that earthing the frame through wet mooring lines while the cover stays charged produces exactly the potential difference required to arc. So the modern verdict, from people who could actually run the experiment, is Theory 1, a hydrogen leak in the stern, ignited by a static discharge as the ship was earthed. That is probably right, and it is worth saying clearly. But notice what the experiment proves and what it does not. It proves the mechanism works. It does not prove it is what happened on the 6th of May, 1937, because there is no way to go back and check whether that particular gas cell was torn, or whether that particular arc jumped. A demonstration that something could happen is not a finding that it did. Which is precisely the distinction the 1937 boards were making when they refused to name a cause, and it is why this case is on this channel rather than in a textbook. What happened to the people is worth a short accounting. Hugo Eckener spent the war under suspicion, refused to join the party, survived, and lived to see the company he built dismantled. He died in 1954. He is one of the very few senior figures in German aviation of that era whose reputation came through the period intact. Max Pruss, the captain, recovered from burns that should have killed him, was disfigured for life, and campaigned until his death in 1960 for airships to fly again with helium. Nobody listened. Werner Franz, the 14-year-old cabin boy, became a mechanic, and for decades hardly spoke about it. He lived until 2014, the last surviving crew member, and gave interviews at the end in which he still described the water tank bursting over him as the reason he was alive. And the ship that was nearly finished in the shed at Frankfurt, the Graf Zeppelin II, the one the trainees were being brought up for, was completed, flew about 30 flights, never carried a paying passenger, and was scrapped in 1940 on Goering's order. Her aluminium went into aircraft too. So here is what the evidence supports, and where it stops. Hydrogen leaked from the stern of the Hindenburg on the evening of the 6th of May, 1937, and an electrical discharge almost certainly lit it. That much is close to settled. Whether the leak came from a wire snapped in a hard turn, and whether the discharge came from the storm, the mooring lines, the fabric, or something a man put there deliberately, that has never been established, and the two governments who looked at it while the wreckage was still warm said so at the time. What is certain is the consequence. Commercial passenger airship travel did not decline after the 6th of May, 1937. It stopped. The Graf Zeppelin was grounded within days and never carried a paying passenger again. Her almost finished sister ship flew briefly and was broken up for aluminium. One last thing, because it is the question people always ask, could you build one now? Technically, yes, and safely, with helium, modern materials, and weather radar that would have kept the Hindenburg away from that storm front entirely. Several companies have tried. The problem is not safety and it is not physics. It is that a lighter-than-air ship is enormous, slow, and enormously affected by wind, and a jet crosses the Atlantic in 7 hours. There is no market for 2.5 days at 125 kilometers an hour, however good the dining room is. The airship did not lose to fire. It lost to speed. The fire just settled the argument 20 years early and made it look like a verdict. 35 people died in that fire and 34,000 had crossed oceans on these ships without a scratch. The difference between those two numbers is 32 seconds, and one spark that nobody has ever identified. And there is a last question worth asking, which is why the reaction was so total. Aircraft crashed constantly in the 1930s. Ocean liners sank. Trains derailed with far higher death tolls and the industries carried on. 35 people died at Lakehurst, and an entire technology was abandoned within weeks. Why this one? Because of the cameras. This was the first mass casualty disaster in history that the public watched. For newsreel companies had crews on that field for a routine arrival. Within days the footage was in cinemas across America and Europe, and millions of people sat in the dark and watched it burn, over and over, with a commentary track. Nobody had ever seen anything like that before. Photographs of disasters existed. Film of the moment itself, from several angles, with sound, did not. The Hindenburg is where that begins, and the reason we still all know exactly what it looked like is that we are watching the same footage those cinema audiences watched in 1937. There is an argument, and I think it is a fair one, that the Hindenburg was not killed by hydrogen at all. It was killed by publicity. The physics of the thing was survivable, 62 people proved that. What was not survivable was 32 seconds of film. The aeroplane finished the job. Within 2 years Pan American was flying the Atlantic with flying boats, and by the end of the war there were 4-engine land planes that could do the crossing in a fraction of the time. The airship was not just discredited. It was obsolete, and it would have been obsolete anyway. If you want more case files, they are on this channel. A woman whose radio nearly overloaded a receiver on an island she could not see, a colony of 115 people who dismantled their own houses and walked away, a Navy ship that vanished with 309 men and never sent a signal. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments which one you would put your money on. 1. The Wire and the Storm. 2. The Skin. 3. Somebody Did It.